My name is Laurel Brauns and I'm a reporter with the Source Weekly. I'm here today with Oregon Senator Tim Knopp, who's running to keep his seat representing Central Oregon in the state legislature. Tim, can you please introduce yourself and give our listeners some reasons why you're running?
Yeah, thank you, Laurel. I'm Tim Knopp, State Senator from District 27, and I'm running because I want to make sure that the citizens of Central Oregon are well represented and that their voice is heard. And the overwhelming majority right now in the legislature are representatives from Portland and the Valley area. And they would like to not have to listen to the voices outside of the metro area. And they need a strong voice representing Central Oregon in different viewpoints. And I think it's an honor to serve and to be able to work with constituents here in Central Oregon. And we have a very difficult job in front of us based on the current state of the economy and with COVID-19. And I want to make sure that there's a good bipartisan voice in the legislature that has been able to demonstrate that they can work together with the other side and try to find common ground on issues like jobs and unemployment and COVID-19, as well as defending education and trying to bring forth more affordable housing.
Thank you. What is your take on how the state is handling the coronavirus response? And what do you feel the legislature's role is as it continues on?
Well, the legislature has been mostly cut out of the coronavirus response. We had an early committee on the coronavirus, but the governor pretty much took over the state response and has been working with her panel of experts in different areas. And so the legislature hasn't had a lot of input on it. I think there was a really important response early on to make sure that we preserved PPE for the healthcare community, our nurses and doctors, and those that were on the front lines of this pandemic early on. And I think the response now is that we need to make sure that we're working to protect the vulnerable and get people back to work as safely and as soon as we possibly can.
What is the single most important thing that the state legislature can do to help Oregon's economy recover from the damage caused by the coronavirus lockdowns?
Well, I really think it's important that we continue to open up our economy as safely as we possibly can. People are suffering right now on two fronts. One, some people are suffering health-wise, and obviously we want to make sure that they're taken care of. But on the other side, people are suffering because they lack employment and they don't have money to put food on the table or to pay the rent and to take care of their families. And so it's really important that we get people back to work and get our economy moving again, because if we don't do that, there won't be even tax funds available to try to help out with the pandemic or try to help people as we have with rental assistance and other things.
Thank you. What would you do to prevent another Republican walkout if the climate change bill is introduced again?
Well, I think as most people know, I was in the Capitol for 2 out of the 3 walkouts, and I really think it's important that people are able to work across the aisle in a bipartisan way. And I think it's important that the majority listen to minority voices. And in the time that I did walk out with Republicans, it was because there was major legislation that was coming forward and they were ignoring a lot of what the rest of the state had to say. And so I think it's important that the majority listens to all the minority voices, takes those into account, and that Republicans are willing to be there and engage, and I've clearly shown that I am. As a matter of fact, in the last legislative session, I was literally the only legislator left in the building when Republicans left, and then Democrats got mad and they left before the session ended, and I was left alone in the Senate chambers. I've, I think, demonstrated that I'm willing to be there and to work with the other side to try to accomplish important things.
Thank you. What are your proposals to tackle reducing emissions in the state if you don't support the sweeping legislation introduced by Democrats?
Well, I've said all along that I'm willing to support a climate bill, but it can't be the most complicated and expensive bill that's out there, and that's really what was pursued. What we're hearing is they're not going to pursue that in this next session, and there are lawsuits that have been brought forth for the governor's executive order that she did on climate change. And so what I really think is important is that we all demonstrate through personal behavior that we're trying to limit our carbon footprint and our emissions. And one of the things I've done over the last few years is I've cut the size of where I live in half, so we've moved to a different place, and I've bought cars that are more energy efficient, so I now have a electric hybrid that I drive, and before that I had a hybrid as well. And so I think it's really about personal responsibility, and I think the legislature can be involved, but it's important that when legislation is brought forward, that I think it's revenue neutral and that it's not just creating cumbersome taxes that ultimately are going to be passed on the consumer. Like in the bill that they tried to pass, there was about a 72-cent a gallon increase in gas, and we call it a tax because there's no other word for it really. It would have increased energy costs, so gas and electric bills up to 50%, and those are the types of things that I think the public doesn't support. And so we need to come up with a solution that's more focused and actually has a significant impact on global climate change.
Thank you. In light of the series of bills that was passed during the last short session in response to police brutality protests, do you feel the state has done enough to address police accountability, or should it do more?
Well, I think there's more to be done. We passed a bill that essentially eliminates chokeholds and knee holds and things like that that have been responsible for the deaths of citizens around the country. But there's more that needs to be done. And so we need to make sure that when somebody is being hired, that the agency who's hiring them has the full picture of who they are, and that nobody is holding back information from a previous employer and not passing that along to the employer that they're currently doing. Also, significant, I think, background checks and training, I think, is critically important. And then I think also tracking incidents of police brutality or police action that involves an injury or a death, I think also very important for the public to know, because we have to create more transparency. And then I think we also need to demilitarize our police forces. You know, there's been talk about how some police forces have rocket launchers and things like that, and I think we need to move away from procuring military equipment and get our police forces back to community policing and interaction with our, with our community and our constituency. And I think we need to fund them properly. I think the idea that we're somehow going to defund the police, I think, is just a really bad idea that's going to lead to a lot more crime, as we've seen in Portland and Seattle.
Thank you. Oregon ranks the worst in the nation for both a high prevalence of mental illness and low access to care, and has one of the highest rates of addiction nationwide. What can an Oregon senator do to reverse this trend?
Well, the first thing we need to do is make sure that we're providing more access, and that means more providers. And so that means we need to either attract more providers through a tax credit to get them to come to communities that don't have as much access or availability for mental health providers, and Bend is somewhat limited in that regard, and Central Oregon is, Redmond and surrounding areas. And so we need to make sure that we're dealing with the the supply issue of providers and providing access for people. And then I think we need to make sure that there's funding available. So it's not on a, if you can pay for it, you can get it, because there's a lot of people who simply can't afford mental health services, and so they need to be there for that. So either through the county or through the private sector, we need to make sure that funding is available for people to get access to that care.
What will you do to support and fund affordable housing in Oregon?
I've already worked on a couple of bills, and not just for Oregon, but locally. So we now have pilot projects here in Bend and Redmond of hundreds of units of affordable housing that came out of last couple legislative sessions that I either sponsored or supported, along with Representative Zika and others, to make sure that we have affordable housing in this area. And I think there's more to be done, and I think we need to make sure that we're not having regulatory impediments to the timelines for development of affordable housing, because we really need it now. As we've all seen, the cost of housing in Bend continues to rise because there's a lack of supply. And so we really need to create more supply, and I work with two nonprofits to try to make that happen in my private life.
Thank you. What would you do to support people without homes? Would you vote for a homelessness state of emergency?
Well, I don't know if we need to vote for one, because one already exists. We have all seen homelessness that continues to expand, and I think if you drive around Central Oregon or you go over to Portland, the homeless encampments have increased dramatically, and that's really because of a lack of affordable units and supply for those who currently don't have homes. And so we need to make sure that we're working on that. I'm working with Eric Tobiasen and Representative Heltz on a veterans village to try to bring some of the homeless veterans out from surrounding area, forest land, and so on, to try to bring them in and provide housing for them as well. And there's literally hundreds of families in Central Oregon who need that exact same help. And so we just need to continue to focus on that and make sure that they're available for people when they need them.
Would you introduce or support a state real estate sales tax or property tax on homes worth more than $500,000 to support affordable housing?
I wouldn't. I think making other housing more expensive isn't really the answer. The average cost of a home in Bend is in the mid 400s, so it's already pushing that 500,000 range. And so to add an additional tax on top of those homes and making that housing even less affordable than it currently is really isn't the answer. I mean, the answer really is to work collaboratively with local communities and with the private sector to develop houses that are affordable, and part of that is land cost. There's cost that's beyond our control, which is the cost of labor and the cost of materials, which we really can't control, but we can control the cost of land. And land in Central Oregon is expensive, and part of that reason for that is because it's in short supply. So we need to expand the supply and make sure that there's enough available. I bought a house here in Bend, one of the houses that I've bought over the years that we've lived in, and so in 2000, the year 2000, we bought a house for $136,000 in Bend, and it was 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, and about 2,000 square feet, which is about the average home here in Central Oregon. And that's way beyond people's reach now, because those homes are $450,000 to $550,000, and a lot of that is due to land costs.
Oregon is experiencing massive fires right now. What is your stance on how to manage wildfire risk in the state at the legislative level? What specific actions are you working on or do you propose?
Well, the Shoots Forest Collaborative has been very successful here in Central Oregon. And I think one of the answers is to make sure that our forests are healthy. And there's been thousands of acres that have been, I think, treated, thinned, and are healthier because of that. And that will help protect us. It doesn't protect us from everything, But we need to make sure that our forests are healthy, and that will put, I think, a damper on some of these fires that are happening. But beyond that, I think we need to make sure that the Oregon Department of Forestry is doing everything it can around the state to, I would say, sensibly and reasonably harvest on our state lands to make sure that the fuel loads are reduced, because those are the things that we can do, and they also provide family wage jobs at the same time.
What is your opinion about the out-of-state corporate timber industry in Oregon? And what would you do to make them more accountable to Oregon communities and the state as a whole?
Well, I think as timber has changed hands over the years in Oregon, it's consolidated more and more with out-of-state timber companies. And it really is important that we make sure that there's a community dialogue, especially with people who are adjacent to those forest lands, making sure that they're understanding what's happening. And there's obviously been issues in the past with spraying and pesticide use and interfacing with landowners who are nearby. And we need to make sure that we're doing what we can to make sure that the community is aware of what the forest owners are doing on property that's adjacent to theirs, and that they're being good neighbors. And I think we need to look at regulation that exists, but Oregon's Forest Practices Act, I think, has done well, but I think it's time to look at it and see if there's ways that we can strengthen that as well.
Would you support interstate commerce in the cannabis industry?
Well, I think it's going to happen, and so I think it's important for us to facilitate it. I don't think there's, Oregon can't make it magically happen, but I think as we've seen, states across the country are moving more toward an Oregon model of, marijuana legalization at some level. And so ultimately there is going to be that interstate commerce. And so whether one wants it or not, it's going to happen. And so the legislature's role is to make sure that we're facilitating that in a way that protects those who shouldn't have marijuana. So all those who are under 21 who shouldn't have access to it, we need to make sure there are laws in place protecting them, whether that marijuana comes from Oregon or it comes from out of state.
Okay. Do you support strengthening the state's gun laws? And if so, what specifically would you do to strengthen them?
Well, gun violence in Oregon has risen recently. And part of that recent rise, I believe, is because Portland defunded and deinvested in their gun violence unit, and they've seen gun violence go up there. And so it's important that we have the police community that's interfacing with those who want to use guns in a destructive way. And so I think it's important that we have safe gun storage, but I think it's best for people to determine what makes the most sense for them and their family, because in rural areas or where people need quick access to that, some of the kind of mandatory things that have been suggested may not work for them. But I think it's a personal responsibility issue for everyone who owns a firearm to make sure that they're storing those and keeping those out of the hands of individuals and using them properly when they have access to them.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about over the last half an hour that you'd like to bring up?
Well, I do think it's really important that as the federal government is working to try to create a vaccine for COVID-19, that they make sure that there are adequate safety trials and that there's adequate education for the public because in order for the public to be interested in a vaccine for COVID-19, they want to know that it's going to be safe and it's going to be effective. And so I think the government needs to provide the transparency that's necessary to make that happen, as opposed to just simply mandates, because I think generally people are suspicious of government right now, and you know, in some ways for good reason. And so I want to make sure that there's plenty of opportunity for the public to, you know, to see what's happened with the safety trials for any vaccine that's brought forward, and that they can work with their provider in, so their doctor or their nurse practitioner, to make sure that they're getting the, you know, the vaccine that they want.
Thank you so much for being here today, Tim.
You're welcome. Thank you.